They sat me at a small staff table in the corner, away from the family, telling me it was more appropriate for a housekeeper. They thought they had put me in my place. In reality, they had given me the perfect vantage point to watch them all one last time before I systematically dismantled their empire piece by piece, using secrets I had collected like loose change for years. It's a funny thing, an assumption. It's an invisible architecture, a framework you build in your mind to make the world simpler. You assume a floor will hold your weight. You assume the sun will rise. You assume that the family you saved from financial ruin, the family whose name your husband carries, sees you as family, as an equal partner in the merger of two lives. That was my assumption. And for a time, I allowed it to stand, even as I saw the cracks forming in the foundation. The Sterling's assumption about me was simpler. They saw Alara Vance, the woman who built Nexus Advisory from nothing, the woman who single-handedly restructured their failing legacy, Sterling Manufacturing, and pulled it back from the brink of absolute collapse, and they assumed I was staff, service, a very competent, very useful housekeeper who had been rewarded with a temporary place at their table. A place, they felt, that could be revoked at any time. Their assumption was their greatest, most spectacular, most beautifully fatal flaw. The event was the engagement party for Tristan's sister. It was held at Crystal Gardens, a place so steeped in old Chicago money that the very air feels heavy with the weight of lineage and entitlement. The scent of 1,000 white lilies was suffocating, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of my throat. It was a masterpiece of curated perfection, Genevieve's touch in every detail. A room full of the city's elite, all orbiting the Sterling family like planets around a dying sun. Tristan had insisted I arrive alone. A last-minute meeting, he'd said. Urgent. A lie, of course, but a tidy one. I see that now. It was all engineered, part of a meticulously planned social execution. I walked in, and it wasn't my husband who greeted me. It was his mother, Genevieve Sterling. She stood there, a formidable socialite in her natural habitat, her smile a perfect, polished weapon. It never reached her eyes. Her eyes were chips of ice. She looked at me, her gaze sweeping from my shoes to my hair in a silent, dismissive appraisal. She saw a woman who had built her success with competence, not inheritance, and it was like looking at a language she refused to learn. "Alara, darling," she said, her voice smooth as silk but with an edge of something sharp beneath it. "So glad you could make it." She gestured to a small table where the place cards were arranged. But she didn't let me look for my own. Her hand, cool and dry, was already holding one out for me, and that's when she handed it to me, the name badge. It was made of a heavy, expensive plastic, the font a tasteful, elegant script. It felt substantial in my hand, solid. A solid little piece of humiliation. It didn't say Alara Vance. It didn't say Alara Sterling. It bore a single, brutal title. One word: housekeeper. My mind, the mind that can see the structural flaws in a failing business and plot the precise, ruthless steps to save it, went completely still. It was like a complex algorithm encountering a variable so unexpected it causes the whole system to freeze for a nanosecond. All the risks I had ever assessed, all the contingencies I had ever formulated, and I had never created a file for this. For this specific, exquisite cruelty. Genevieve's smile widened just a fraction. An admission of guilt, an expression of triumph. She believed in the superiority of bloodlines over talent, and this little piece of plastic was her gospel. It was her way of reminding me that I was just a service provider who had been rewarded with a temporary seat. She expected a reaction, tears perhaps, a scene, a hysterical outburst that would confirm all her prejudices about new money. I gave her nothing. My face was a mask of polite neutrality. I took the badge. The little pin felt cold against my fingers. I clipped it to the lapel of my dress. They expect tears. They expect a drama of their own making. Let them watch it. Let them enjoy the show. Moving through that crowd was like swimming through poison. It was designed to be a slow, layered death. First, the subtle glances. A person's eyes would flick down to my chest, then quickly away. A flicker of confusion, then dawning comprehension, then a little smirk. Then came the whispers, a sibilant wave of sound that followed me around the room. Stifled laughter behind manicured hands, I was a pariah branded by a piece of plastic, a ghost at the feast. I saw Tristan then, across the room, laughing with a circle of men from his firm lakeshore capital. Projecting that image he loved so much, the untouchable titan of finance. A man coasting on his family name, so deeply insecure about his wife's superior intellect that he had to call her company her little hobby just to feel tall. He caught my eye. He saw the badge, and he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a little smile playing on his lips. He was in on it. Of course he was. This wasn't just his mother's cruelty. This was a joint venture, a partnership. The only one, it seemed, they were still capable of honoring. The real performance began at dinner. The grand Sterling family table, a monument to their own self-importance. Tristan's sister, the newly engaged debutante, her vapid fiancé, various aunts and uncles, their faces sagging under the weight of generations of inherited wealth, and Genevieve presiding over it all like a queen. Tristan took his seat, and then he looked up, a perfect picture of feigned surprise. There was no chair for me. A waiter, young and clearly flustered, started to rush forward with a spare chair. Tristan held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. He shushed the poor boy publicly, and then he laughed, a loud, booming laugh that drew the attention of the whole table. "It's all right," he announced, his voice carrying across the expensive china. "She can help serve. It's what she's good at." The line was delivered perfectly. A little joke for his friends and family. The chuckles rippled around the table, condescending and sharp. I just stood there by the table as the waiters began to serve the first course. The clink of silver on porcelain was deafening. My own husband, the man I had once considered a merger of equals, a man whose charm I believed complemented my own dynamic success, had just reduced me from partner to staff in front of their entire world. But the final blow, the truly unforgivable moment, was yet to come. It was the killing stroke, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. A waiter came to me, holding a plate of lobster, his expression a mixture of pity and confusion. He didn't know the script. He was just trying to do his job. Before he could place it down, Genevieve looked up from her own meal. Her face was a mask of feigned concern, her voice just loud enough for everyone at the table, and the tables nearby to hear clearly. "Oh, darling," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Food is for family." The words hung in the air. For family. In that single moment, the entire ledger of my life was thrown out of balance. I lost everything. Not my fortune, not my company, but the illusions I had allowed myself to maintain. The illusion of a marriage, the belief in a shared future, any last lingering ember of affection for the family whose legacy I had personally, painstakingly salvaged. The crime wasn't the insult. It was the public, deliberate, meticulous erasure of my identity. It was a fundamental violation of the partnership I thought I had. I stood there for a beat, frozen, letting the wave of humiliation wash over me, feeling its cold touch, and then letting it recede. They were all watching, waiting for the breakdown, waiting for the tears. Instead, I moved with a slow, deliberate grace. I reached up and I unclipped the name badge from my dress. The little plastic rectangle felt heavy. I leaned forward, over the pristine white tablecloth, and I placed it directly in the center of the empty space where my plate should have been, a perfect silent statement. Then I turned, and without a single word, without a single backward glance, I walked out of Crystal Gardens. The real story was beginning now, and they were not the authors. The drive home was silent. My hands were steady on the wheel. I didn't cry. Crying is an emotional expenditure, an inefficient processing of data. What I was feeling was something far colder, far more useful. It was clarity, the kind of profound, clean beauty I usually only find in a perfectly balanced ledger. I drove past the landmarks of a dead marriage. The theater where we saw that show on our third date. The restaurant where he proposed. The park bench where we'd talked about the future. Each one was a memory, and my mind, which operates like a complex algorithm, was processing them with brutal efficiency. Every memory is now an asset to be liquidated. Every shared secret, a potential liability for him. The emotional audit is complete. The marriage is officially, irrevocably insolvent. Our apartment was exactly as I had left it. Minimalist, orderly, a creature of my own habits. I walked past the photos of us, the smiling strangers on the wall, and my face betrayed nothing. No emotion. Emotions are to be compartmentalized, handled with the same efficiency as a company's P&L statement. The cruelty I had just endured wasn't a messy, passionate breakdown. It was simply the trigger, the calm, methodical activation of a long-dormant contingency plan. I went to my home office, my sanctuary of order, the one place in this shared apartment that was truly mine. Tristan always called this my hobby room. He never once asked what I was building in here. He never showed the slightest curiosity about the complex systems I designed, the terabytes of data I analyzed, the corporate empires I saved from this very chair. His ignorance was his greatest gift to me. I sat down, the leather of the chair cool against my skin. The city lights glittered outside my window. I typed a complex, multi-layered password into my encrypted system. It required a biometric scan and a randomized key code from a physical token I kept in a safe. Tristan thought it was for my client work at Nexus Advisory. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he was not entirely right either. On my desktop there was a folder. It was labeled innocuously, Sterling MFG Restructuring, the file I had created when I poured months of my life into saving his father's company. The project the entire Sterling family mistook for dutiful obsession, never bothering to understand the architect who saved their legacy. I opened the folder. Inside was another file, this one protected by a separate, even more complex password. It was named Project Revelation. I started this file the day I saved his father's company. That was when I first saw it. The rot, the structural weaknesses not just in their balance sheets but in their ethics. I saw how they moved money, how they lied, how they built their gilded cage on a foundation of carefully hidden fraud. I started documenting it. Not out of malice, not then, but out of prudence, the same way I advise any company to have an insurance policy against catastrophic risk. It was a contingency plan for the business of my marriage, just in case its core assets ever turned toxic. Tonight, they stood up in front of the world and announced their decision to file the claim. I typed in the final password. The file opened. And there it was. Years of work. Meticulously organized subfolders. Offshore bank statements from Genevieve's accounts. The very funds she hid from her ex-husband during their divorce. Scanned copies of fraudulent invoices from the Sterling manufacturing restructuring, the ones his father had signed off on. A detailed log of Tristan's secret meetings. His affairs, complete with names, dates, and copies of hotel receipts. And the crown jewel. A complete, irrefutable map of his large-scale embezzlement from Lakeshore Capital. A scheme he was so arrogant about, so convinced of his own cleverness, that he believed it was utterly undetectable. He genuinely could not conceive of a world where the quiet, supportive woman he married was capable of even understanding it, let alone dismantling his entire fraudulent empire. My work here was done. The plan was already complete. It had been complete for over a year. I got up from my desk and walked to the small kitchenette adjoining my office. I calmly made myself a cup of tea. Earl Grey, my favorite, a creature of habit, even now. I returned to my desk and sat, the warm cup in my hands, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face. I sipped it slowly. There was no rush. They believe they have won the night. Let them. Let them sleep in their victory, drunk on champagne and their own perceived superiority. Let them dream their dreams in their gilded cages, because tomorrow, the world they know simply ceases to exist. The market will correct, the accounts will be balanced, and I will be the one to sign the demolition order. They called me a housekeeper, a simple, one-word assessment designed to erase my identity, to put me in a box labeled service. And in a way, they were right. For years, I had been housekeeping for the Sterling family. I cleaned up the mess of their failing legacy, Sterling Manufacturing, balancing their books and restructuring their debt. I tidied up my husband's insecurities, managing his fragile ego and presenting a facade of a supportive, less threatening wife. I kept their secrets, dusting them away into the dark corners of my mind. The irony is that my final act of service, the one they will remember for the rest of their short, miserable lives, will be to clean house one last time. A final thorough, systematic purge. The plan, which I named Project Revelation, was not born from the humiliation of that night. That was merely the catalyst, the final, undeniable data point that confirmed the entire system was corrupt and required demolition. The plan was an insurance policy, drafted with the cold precision of a prenuptial agreement, for the day my emotional investment in the sterling name was declared a total loss. And as I sat in my office, the city lights painting cold streaks across the window, I knew that claim had been filed. The grace period was over. The night of the party was the end of my life as Alara Vance Sterling. The woman who believed in mergers, in partnerships, in the possibility of shared futures. She was a liability I could no longer afford. The woman who woke up the next morning was someone different. She was simply Alara Vance, and she was the sole executor of the Sterling estate. Their legacy, their reputation, their freedom, it was all just an asset portfolio, and I was about to initiate a hostile takeover. My campaign would not be waged with loud accusations or messy confrontations. That was their language, the language of chaotic emotion and brute force. Mine is the language of numbers, of data, of the quiet, irrefutable truth buried in a line of code or a transaction record. My revenge would be a series of precise, calculated strikes, delivered from the quiet anonymity of my office. It would be a symphony of collapse. And I, the silent conductor, they thought they had uninvited me from the family dinner. They had no idea I was about to burn down the entire house, with them still sitting at the table. The sun rose on a Saturday. A perfect, clear Chicago morning, the kind of day that feels full of promise. For the Sterlings, it was just another day of blissful, arrogant ignorance. They would have woken up late, nursing champagne headaches, perhaps laughing about the previous night's little drama. Genevieve would be planning a charity luncheon. Tristan would be playing golf, bragging to his friends. They believed they had won. They had put the housekeeper in her place. I, on the other hand, was already at work. There was no rage, no adrenaline, just a calm, focused energy, the kind I feel when I'm in the final stages of a complex corporate restructuring. The target is identified, the weaknesses are mapped, the strategy is in place. All that remains is execution. Phase 1 of Project Revelation was aimed at the heart of Tristan's arrogance, his career at Lakeshore Capital. He saw himself as a master of the universe, a brilliant financier. In reality, he was a common thief in an expensive suit. His embezzlement scheme was clever, I'll grant him that. A complex web of shell corporations, falsified trade orders, and carefully manipulated expense reports. It was designed to be invisible to a standard audit. But I am not a standard auditor. For 2 years, I had traced every dollar. I built a shadow ledger, a perfect mirror of his entire fraudulent operation. I had the wire transfer confirmations, the IP addresses from which the trades were made, the encrypted emails he'd sent to his co-conspirators. I had everything. And the beauty of a digital crime is that the evidence is permanent. It's just data, waiting for the right analyst to interpret it. The Securities and Exchange Commission has a whistleblower program. It's an elegant system. It allows individuals with knowledge of financial misconduct to report it, anonymously and securely. It's a tool for market correction, and I am a firm believer in a well-regulated market. I spent the morning drafting the report. It was a work of art, not a frantic, emotional accusation, but a cold, clinical dissection of a crime. It was 27 pages long, complete with appendices, cross-referenced exhibits, and a detailed narrative of the entire scheme from inception to its current state. I wrote it in the dry, technical language of a forensic accountant. I laid out the path for them so clearly that a first-year intern could follow the money. I attached the key documents, the falsified invoices, the bank statements from the offshore accounts, the email chains. I packaged Tristan's entire professional life into a neat, tidy digital coffin. The submission process was anticlimactic. A series of clicks, a progress bar, a confirmation page. Your tip has been submitted. Reference number 73459A2. I screenshotted the confirmation, saved it to a new folder titled Receipts, and closed the browser. The first shot was fired, a silent, digital bullet, traveling at the speed of light towards the heart of Tristan's world. He would never see it coming. He wouldn't know a thing for weeks, maybe months. The SEC is a bureaucracy. It moves slowly, methodically, but it is relentless. An investigation would be opened. Subpoenas would be issued. His colleagues would be questioned. His life at Lakeshore Capital would begin to unravel, thread by thread, and he would have no idea why. He would have no one to blame. That was the point. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about psychological warfare. I wanted him to live in a world that no longer made sense. A world where the rules he had always bent to his will suddenly snapped back and broke him. I wanted him to feel the cold dread of an invisible, omniscient enemy, an enemy who knew his every secret. He would tear his own life apart looking for the source of the attack, and he would never think to look at the woman he called a housekeeper. With the SEC report filed, I turned my attention to the domestic theater. The apartment. Our apartment. It was a museum of a dead marriage. Every object held a memory, a data point in a failed experiment. I moved through the space with the detachment of an auctioneer appraising assets. His golf clubs. His collection of absurdly expensive watches. The abstract art he'd bought because a gallery owner told him it was a good investment. It was all just stuff. The material residue of a life built on surface and pretense. I packed one bag, my clothes, my personal laptop, my books, the things that belonged to Alara Vance. I left behind everything that had been touched by the fiction of Alara Sterling. I took the physical token from my encrypted system, of course. A small essential piece of hardware. And I took one other thing, a photo of us. The one from his nightstand. The one he looked at every night before he went to sleep. The one where we both looked so happy, so full of potential. I didn't take it for sentimental reasons. Sentiment is an inefficient emotion. I took it as a trophy, a reminder of the lie I had once been willing to live inside. I left my wedding ring on my pillow, a perfect, brilliant cut diamond. An excellent conductor of heat, but a very poor symbol of commitment, it turned out. I placed it in the center of the pillow, a small, glittering monument to a broken contract. Then I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I closed it softly, the lock clicking into place with a quiet, final sound. I was liquidating my personal assets, and the first to go was my address. Phase 2 was designed to fracture the Sterling family's foundation, their name. The Sterling name wasn't just a name. It was a brand built on a carefully constructed myth of old Chicago industry, integrity, and tradition. A myth that was about to be publicly debunked. Sterling Manufacturing was the source of their pride and their wealth, and it was rotten to the core. When I restructured the company, I did so with brutal efficiency, but I also did so with complete transparency on my end. I documented everything, including the things Tristan's father, a man of performative integrity and deep actual corruption, tried to hide. Specifically, a series of fraudulent invoices, a classic scheme. Overinflated contracts awarded to a vendor, a shell company owned by a cousin, who would then kick back a percentage of the profits in cash. It was how they'd been skimming from their own company for decades. It was sloppy. It was arrogant. And it was all meticulously documented in my files. I couldn't just dump all the evidence at once. That would be messy, inelegant. It would point back to me, the person who had access to all the company's financials. No, this required a more delicate touch. A surgeon's scalpel, not a butcher's cleaver. I chose my weapon carefully. A journalist at the Chicago Tribune. A man named David Chen. He was old school, tenacious. He had a reputation for taking down corporate titans, and he hated inherited wealth. He was the perfect vector for my information. I created a new anonymous email address, something untraceable, and I sent him a single tantalizing email. The subject line was, "The cracks in the Sterling Foundation." The body of the email was brief. "Mr. Chen," it began, "you have built a career on exposing the truth behind this city's most powerful families. Perhaps it's time you looked into Sterling Manufacturing, not the company they pretend to be, but the one that exists in the shadows. Ask them about their relationship with a company called Midwest Logistical Solutions. Ask them why they paid $1.2 million for consulting services in the third quarter of last year. Some stories are hiding in plain sight. This is one of them. And then, the hook. I attached a single document, not the whole file. Just one of the fraudulent invoices. A single damning piece of paper, just enough to light the fire. I hit send, and the second domino began to fall. David Chen would not be able to resist. He would start digging. He would file Freedom of Information Act requests. He would interview disgruntled former employees. He would put Sterling Manufacturing under a microscope, and the company, already financially fragile, would not survive the scrutiny. The Sterling brand, their most valuable asset, was about to be tarnished beyond repair. The first few weeks were a study in delayed gratification. I watched from a distance, a ghost in the machine. I had moved into a corporate apartment, a sterile, anonymous space that suited my new life perfectly. I continued my work at Nexus Advisory, my focus sharper than ever. My clients saw no change. My life was a model of efficiency and order. Meanwhile, the Sterling's world was beginning to tilt on its axis. The first reports were just whispers, rumors on financial blogs, a brief mention on a cable news ticker. But then the whispers grew louder. David Chen's first article was a masterpiece of insinuation. It didn't accuse, not directly. It simply asked questions. Questions that had no good answers. Sterling Manufacturing's stock took a nosedive. Their lenders started calling. Tristan, I heard through the grapevine of the financial world, was becoming erratic. He was convinced a rival at Lakeshore was trying to sabotage him. He started pointing fingers, making wild accusations. He was burning bridges, his paranoia consuming him. He called me, of course, dozens of times. His calls went straight to voicemail. His texts were a frantic cascade of confusion, then anger, then pathetic, transparent pleading. Alara, where are you? This is insane. Call me. Did you see the news? My dad is going crazy. It's a lie. Why are you doing this? What did I do? Just talk to me. I know you're behind this. You and your sick, twisted games. You will regret this. Baby, please. I'm sorry. For everything. Just come home. We can fix this. As if it were a leaky faucet. A minor domestic inconvenience. He still didn't understand the scale of what was happening. He still thought this was about us. About a fight. He couldn't conceive that this was a demolition. Phase 3 was personal. It was aimed at the architect of my public humiliation, Genevieve Sterling. Her money was her power, but her social standing was her lifeblood. She lived for the charity galas, the society pages, the fawning attention of the city's elite. Her entire identity was built on her reputation as the matriarch of the Sterling family, a woman of taste, class, and unimpeachable character. It was time for a character reassessment. Genevieve's secret was a simple one, common among her class: tax evasion. During her bitter divorce from Tristan's father, she had managed to hide several $1 million in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. A little nest egg she conveniently forgot to declare to the IRS. It was her safety net, her secret weapon. And I had the account numbers. I had the transaction records. I had the name of the shell corporation she'd used to create it. My target this time wasn't a serious journalist. It was a gossip columnist, a woman whose articles were read by every socialite in Chicago. Her name was Brenda Davies, and her column, Brenda's Buzz, was a weapon of mass social destruction. My anonymous email to Brenda was different. It was chatty, conspiratorial. It was written in the language of gossip. Brenda, darling, it began, you are the only one brave enough to tell the real stories in this town. While everyone is focused on the troubles at Sterling Manufacturing, they're missing the real scandal. The grande dame of Chicago society, Genevieve Sterling, isn't quite the paragon of virtue she pretends to be. Have you ever wondered how she maintains such a lavish lifestyle? Perhaps you should look into a little entity called Azure Holdings Limited in the Cayman Islands. You might find that her charity work is a bit selective, specifically the charity of Genevieve Sterling. I attached a single bank statement. A statement showing a balance of over $4 million. Brenda Davies published the story 2 days later. It was the lead item in her column. It was brutal. It was magnificent. She didn't just report the facts. She framed them in the most scandalous light possible. She painted Genevieve as a hypocrite, a tax cheat, a socialite who preached philanthropy while hiding millions from the government. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The boards of the charities she sat on demanded her resignation. The invitations to the galas stopped coming. Her friends, the ones who had laughed with her at my expense, suddenly wouldn't take her calls. In her world, a world built on image and perception, this was a death sentence. She had been publicly, irrevocably shamed. They had put a label on me, housekeeper. Now Genevieve had a new label, tax cheat. Mine had been a temporary humiliation. Hers would follow her to the grave. The cumulative effect of the 3 attacks was exactly what I had predicted. The Sterling family, deprived of their financial security, their public reputation, and their social standing began to cannibalize itself. They were a family held together not by love, but by money and image. With those things gone, there was nothing left but suspicion and resentment. Tristan blamed his father for the mess at the company. His father blamed Tristan for drawing negative attention to the family with his flamboyant lifestyle. And they both blamed Genevieve for the social disgrace that was now attached to their name. The House of Sterling was collapsing from within. I watched it all from my quiet, orderly apartment. I read the news articles. I tracked the stock price. I monitored the social media chatter. I was a scientist observing an experiment, my hypothesis being proven correct at every stage. There was a cold, clean satisfaction in it. The satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan. The balancing of a ledger that had been in the red for far too long. But the final phase of Act 2 was still to come. The financial ruin, the public shame, that was for the family, for the institution. But for Tristan, the man who had looked me in the eye and nodded as his mother humiliated me, the man who had laughed and said, "She can help serve." For him, I had reserved a special, more personal final blow. He had lost his job. Lakeshore Capital had placed him on indefinite leave pending the results of the SEC investigation. He had lost his family's money. He was a pariah in the city. But he had one thing left, one last pillar of support, his new fiancée, the young, impressionable daughter of another wealthy Chicago family, the woman for whom the engagement party had been thrown. She was his last hope for a comeback, a way to merge with another dynasty and save himself. It was time to demolish that last pillar. Tristan's infidelities were numerous and well documented. He was a cliché, the powerful man who thought he could have everything. I had a file on each of his affairs, names, dates, hotel receipts, copies of text messages he thought he had deleted, a pathetic, sordid history of betrayal. I chose the most recent one, an affair he was having with a junior analyst at his own firm, an affair that had been going on for 6 months, an affair that was still active. This time, the delivery vector was not a journalist or a government agency. It was a simple, elegant, hand-delivered package. I compiled a portfolio, a greatest hits of Tristan's betrayal, the hotel receipts, with the dates and times clearly visible, the credit card statements showing charges for expensive gifts I had never received, and the photographs. I had hired a private investigator months ago. A discreet, professional man who had provided me with a series of high-resolution, incontrovertible photographs of Tristan and his lover. Kissing outside a downtown bar, entering a boutique hotel, laughing together over dinner. I placed it all in a beautiful black box, tied with a single white ribbon. And I included a simple unsigned card. The card read, "A wedding gift. From a woman who believes you deserve to know the truth." I had the package delivered by courier to the fiancé's family home, not to her but to her father, a notoriously protective old-world patriarch who valued family honor above all else. I timed the delivery for a Friday evening when I knew the family would be together. I didn't have to wait long. The news broke on Sunday. The engagement was off. The society pages reported it as a mutual, amicable decision. But the real story spread like wildfire through the city's elite. Tristan Sterling, already disgraced and under investigation, had been caught in a sordid affair. He had been unceremoniously dumped. His last lifeline was gone. The final scene of Act 2 was not mine to witness directly, but it was reported to me by a contact who was there. It took place at the Chicago Yacht Club, one of the last places that hadn't yet banned him. Tristan was there, drinking heavily at the bar. He was disheveled, ranting, a ghost of the confident man he had once been. His fiancée's father walked in, flanked by his 2 sons. There was no grand confrontation, no shouting match, just a few quiet, cold words, and then Tristan, completely unhinged, began to scream. He screamed about conspiracies, about rivals, about how everyone was out to get him. He threw a glass against the wall. He had to be physically removed by security. A full, complete public meltdown. He had lost everything. His money, his job, his family, his reputation, his future. He was utterly, completely alone. The demolition was complete. The accounts were balanced. As I sat in my apartment, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city, a feeling settled over me. It wasn't joy. It wasn't happiness. It was quiet. The quiet of a ledger brought to zero. The quiet of a project completed. The revelation campaign was over. But the story was not. There was still one final entry to be made. One last face-to-face meeting. One last truth to be revealed. He deserved to know who had signed the demolition order. He deserved to look his executioner in the eye. The demolition of the House of Sterling was not a single explosive event. It was a controlled implosion, executed with the precision of a corporate restructuring. I was the architect, the engineer, and the sole signatory on the demolition order. They had built their lives on a foundation of arrogance and deceit, and I simply exposed the structural flaws until the entire edifice collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Each phase of the revelation campaign was a calculated, dispassionate strike aimed at a specific load-bearing pillar. First, Tristan's career, the source of his pride, dissolved by a single, anonymous tip to the SEC. Then, the family's reputation, their most valuable brand, tarnished beyond repair by a carefully leaked invoice to an ambitious journalist. Then, Genevieve's social standing, the very air she breathed, poisoned by a whisper to a gossip columnist about a little secret in the Cayman Islands. They turned on each other as I knew they would, their bonds of loyalty dissolving as their assets were frozen and their names became synonymous with scandal. The final act was reserved for Tristan, a quiet, elegant package delivered to his fiancée's father, containing the irrefutable proof of his betrayal. His last lifeline, his final hope for a merger that would save him, was severed. I watched from a distance as he lost everything, his job, his money, his family, his future. It was a perfect systematic liquidation. The accounts were balanced. The ledger was clear. But a final transaction remained. The satisfaction was in the successful execution of the plan, the cold, quiet hum of a complex system working exactly as designed. But the project wasn't truly complete. An audit requires a final review, a face-to-face confirmation that the debt has been paid in full. He deserved to know who the creditor was. He needed to look his executioner in the eye and understand, with perfect clarity, the full cost of underestimating the housekeeper. The weeks that followed were quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage. I watched the aftermath from the sterile comfort of my new life, a ghost observing the ruins of a world I had once inhabited. The news cycle moved on, as it always does. The Sterlings were no longer a headline. They were a cautionary tale, a footnote in the city's financial history. Sterling Manufacturing was being sold off for parts. Genevieve had retreated from public life, a social hermit trapped in her gilded cage. And Tristan. Tristan was a ghost, I had my sources, a network of contacts in the financial and legal worlds. The reports I received painted a portrait of a man completely hollowed out. He was living in a small rented condo, his assets frozen, his friends gone. He spent his days in a paranoid haze, drinking cheap whiskey, and trying to piece together the conspiracy he believed had destroyed him. He blamed everyone, his rivals at Lakeshore, his father, a vengeful ex-girlfriend. His mind, so accustomed to a world that bent to his will, simply could not process a reality in which he was the author of his own demise. He was a king deposed, wandering the ruins of his kingdom, muttering about traitors. He was ready. The final entry in the ledger could now be made. My communication was not a text message or a phone call. That would have been personal, emotional. This was a business transaction. I had my lawyer draft a simple, formal letter. It was delivered to his condo by a process server. The letter requested a meeting. It gave a time and a place. It was not a request. It was a summons. He would not ignore it. The mention of final terms would be a hook he couldn't resist. He would assume it was about money, about some last pathetic attempt to claim a piece of a fortune that no longer existed. He would come expecting to see a desperate woman. He would be wrong. I chose the location with care. Not a power lunch restaurant or a sterile boardroom, not my territory or his. I chose a small anonymous coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us frequented, a place with no history, a perfectly neutral ground for the final audit. I arrived early. I sat at a table in the back, facing the door. I felt a profound sense of calm. There was no anger left, no hatred, just the quiet, focused stillness of a task nearing completion. I was an analyst about to present my findings. The data was collected, the report was written. All that remained was the final debriefing. He was late. Of course he was. Punctuality is a courtesy, and he had none left to give. When he finally walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by wrinkled jeans and a stained jacket. His face was pale and puffy. His eyes were bloodshot and darting around the room with a hunted, paranoid energy. He looked cheap. The swagger, the easy confidence of inherited wealth, had been stripped away, and what was left was small and weak. He scanned the room, looking for me. He looked right past me twice. He was looking for Alara Sterling, the polished wife, the society figure. He didn't see the woman in the simple black dress, the woman who had always been invisible to him. Finally, his eyes landed on me. There was a flicker of confusion, then a sneer formed on his lips. He shuffled over to my table and slumped into the chair opposite me, the legs scraping against the floor. "Ilara," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was thick with resentment. "What is this? Your lawyer said you wanted to talk about a settlement. There's nothing left to take. You know that?" I just looked at him. I let the silence hang in the air. I let him stew in his own bitterness. He couldn't meet my gaze. His eyes kept darting towards the door, as if he expected federal agents to burst in at any moment. "I don't want your money, Tristan," I said. My voice was quiet even. "There is no money." "Then what do you want?" He spat. "To gloat? To see how far I've fallen? Well, here I am. Are you happy now?" I took a slow sip of my tea. It was cold. "This isn't about happiness," I said. "This is about balancing a ledger. You have spent the last few months consumed by a question. Who did this to me? You have a list of suspects, I'm sure. A grand conspiracy. I am here to give you the answer, to close the file." He just stared at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. He had no idea what I was talking about. He was a man trying to read a language he had never learned. "It started with an anonymous tip to the SEC," I began, my voice calm and methodical, like I was dictating a report. A very detailed, very well-documented report on a long-term embezzlement scheme at Lakeshore Capital. It laid out the entire structure, the shell corporations, the fraudulent trades, everything, the kind of report only someone with an intimate knowledge of your finances could have written. Tristan's face went pale. The sneer was gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening comprehension. "Then," I continued, "a single fraudulent invoice from Sterling Manufacturing found its way to an investigative journalist. Just one, enough to make him start digging. He found the rest on his own. Your father's company was a house of cards. It only needed a small push. Emphasize, a small push. I let that sink in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. And while the family was dealing with the financial fallout," I went on, my voice never wavering, "a certain gossip columnist received a very interesting bank statement from an offshore holding company in the Cayman Islands. A statement that made Genevieve's charity work look hypocritical. It's amazing how quickly a social reputation can be liquidated." He was shaking his head now, a low, guttural sound coming from the back of his throat. The gears were turning in his shattered mind, the pieces clicking into place. The paranoia in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a much deeper, much purer horror. "It wasn't a rival," I said softly. "It wasn't your father's enemies. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was me." The words landed in the quiet coffee shop with the force of a physical blow. He flinched as if I had struck him. He stared at me, his mouth agape. He was looking at me, truly looking at me, for the first time. And he was seeing not his wife, not the housekeeper, but a stranger, a ghost who had been living in his house, at his table, in his bed, for years. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why?" And there it was. The final pathetic question. The question that proved he had learned nothing. I reached into my bag and I took out the photograph. The one from his nightstand. The picture of us, smiling, on a yacht in a life that no longer existed. I slid it across the table. "You want to know why?" I asked, my voice still quiet, but now edged with the cold, hard steel of a final judgment. "Because at your sister's engagement party, in front of your entire world, you and your mother put a name badge on me that said housekeeper. You sat me at a staff table. You laughed and announced that I could help serve. And then, your mother, with your smiling approval, looked at me and said, 'Food is for family.'" Each word was a hammer blow. I saw the memory flicker in his eyes. The memory he had dismissed as a trifle, a little joke. He saw it now for what it was. The signed confession, the declaration of war. "You didn't just insult me, Tristan," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You erased me. You declared in the most public way imaginable that our partnership was void, that I was not family, that I was staff. And you were right. I was a housekeeper. I have spent the last several months cleaning house. Your house." He just stared at the photograph, his hands trembling. The full, monstrous scale of his miscalculation was crashing down on him. He hadn't been destroyed by a powerful enemy. He had been dismantled, piece by piece, by the one person in the world he had deemed utterly powerless. The quiet, efficient woman whose mind he had never once bothered to understand. His reaction was not the explosion I had expected. There was no rage, no screaming, no accusations, just a slow, silent, complete collapse. The last of the air went out of him. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He looked down at the smiling man in the photograph, and I could see him trying to reconcile that man with the broken shell he had become. The algorithm of his life had encountered a fatal error, and his entire operating system was shutting down. I stood up. The meeting was over. The ledger was balanced. "The next time you decide to destroy someone, Tristan," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "make sure they aren't the one who holds all the keys." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I left him there, in that cheap coffee shop, with the ghost of his dead life on the table in front of him. A man who had everything and lost it all because he couldn't see the person standing right in front of him. I walk through the city now, and it feels different. The towering buildings, the symbols of power and commerce, they don't seem so intimidating anymore. I've seen behind the curtain. I know how fragile they are, how easily they can be brought down. The question people always ask about revenge is, was it worth it? They expect a simple answer, a yes or a no. But the truth is, the question itself is flawed. It operates on a false assumption. It assumes that the person who finishes the journey is the same person who began it. I am not that woman anymore. The woman who walked out of Crystal Gardens that night was fueled by a cold, righteous fury. She had a clear objective, to correct a gross imbalance in the ledger, to see justice done, and she succeeded. Every debt was collected. Every asset was liquidated. The numbers all add up to zero, a perfect, clean balance. But a balanced ledger is just an absence of debt. It is not a profit. The revenge was a necessary, logical, and flawlessly executed business decision, but it came at a cost. The price of victory was the very thing I was fighting for, the belief in partnership, the possibility of trust. In order to dismantle their corrupt world, I had to adopt its tools: secrecy, ruthlessness, a complete detachment from emotion. I became a mirror of the thing I sought to destroy. I am free now. I am not a Sterling. I am not a wife. I am not a housekeeper. I am just Ilara Vance, the architect, the analyst, a woman alone in a tall building looking out over a city of strangers. I won. I comprehensively, unequivocally won. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the city is asleep and the only sound is the hum of my own systems, I find myself thinking about that name badge. Housekeeper, a single word. And I wonder, after all this cleaning, after sweeping away the entire Sterling dynasty, if the dust will ever truly settle. And there you have it, a complete, systematic demolition of an entire empire, all stemming from one beautifully fatal assumption. It's a chilling reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the one you should fear the most. Thank you so much for sticking with this intense story to the very end. Your attention is truly appreciated. If you found this narrative compelling, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. And I have to ask, was Ilara's revenge justified, or did she become the very thing she sought to destroy? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I'll be reading and responding to as many as I can. For more stories of intricate plots and powerful characters, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a chapter. And finally, the best way to support the channel is by sharing this video with a friend who appreciates a story where the ledger is balanced, down to the last cent. Until the next story, watch who you underestimate.